My grandfather called it the dead shell, and for as long as I can remember it sat on the third shelf of his workbench, wedged between a coffee tin of bolts and a cracked engine housing nobody ever got around to scrapping. It was the size of a man's fist, segmented like a beetle's back, bronze gone dark with age, with a crystal seam running down its spine that never once caught the light. He found it on a salvage run off the Kabara Reef when he was younger than I am now. And he kept it not because it was worth anything it wasn't, not to anyone who tried to sell it, but because every single person who tried to sell it walked away with a burn across their palm shaped like that seam. 3 generations of us learned to leave it alone. My father used to say it was just bad wiring, some old capacitor that hadn't finished dying. He said that the way men say things they don't believe but need to, so the shelf stays where it is, and nobody has to think about it again. I run the salvage yard now, on the same stretch of coast, in the same long shed, built into the rusted-out hull of a survey craft that grounded itself, here before any of us were born. Most days it's tide-wrecked drone parts and stripped hull plating, the kind of work that pays for diesel, and not much else. The shell came with the rest of the inheritance, packed in a crate of things nobody wanted, and I put it on my own shelf, because that's where it had always gone, and because some habits aren't really yours to break. It was an ordinary evening, late, the kind of late, where the light through the shed's gapped roof turns the color of weak tea, and the only sound is the tide working at the hull plates outside. I was cleaning gear, the way I do most nights, wiping down tools before I put them up, and I picked the shell off the shelf without really deciding to. I'd done it 100 times. You don't think about a thing you've handled your whole life. I turned it over in the rag, getting grit out of the seam the way I might clean an old hinge, and my thumb found a groove along the underside I'd never noticed. A worn smooth tip, shaped almost like it had been pressed or fitted to something. My thumb settled into it without me meaning it to. It just fit, the way a tool handle fits after years of one man's grip. The hum started so low I felt it before I heard it, in my teeth, in the bones of my hand. Then the crystal seam along its spine lit, not bright. Just a thin line of pale gold working down its length like a fuse catching. Slow and deliberate. I should have dropped it. Every story I'd ever been told said to drop it. Instead, I stood there with my thumb locked in that groove, watching the light spread, and I felt, I don't have a better word for it, recognized. The way a dog knows its name before it knows what a name is. The segments along its back began to shift, sliding under plate, with a sound like a held breath being let out slow. It wasn't violent. It was patient, the way a hand opens when it's finally ready to. Inside, where I'd expected wiring or rot, there was a lattice of the same pale gold light, fine as a web, and at its center a single dark facet that turned, I swear it turned, to face me. I heard myself say something stupid. A man says, when his mouth needs to do something while his mind catches up, I said, easy, easy now. Like it was a spooked animal, and not 300 years of something finally waking up in my hands. The light steadied. The hum dropped to something almost gentle, almost like a held note settling into tune. And then it spoke. Not in the air, not exactly. In that same place I'd felt the hum first, behind my back teeth, in the marrow. Vessel of the old Wardens, it said. We have been waiting on your line. I stood there a long time after that. The tide kept working at the hull outside, same as it had every night of my life. And the light through the roof kept going that weak TA color. And none of it had changed, except that everything had. I thought about my grandfather and the burn shaped like that seam that he never talked about. Except once, drunk, late, saying it hadn't hurt the way a burn should. Said it had felt more like a door closing in his hand. I thought about my father, calling it bad wiring so he wouldn't have to call it anything else. I understood, standing there, that neither of them had been wrong to be afraid of it, and neither of them had been right to call it dead. It had been waiting. It had been testing every hand that came near it for longer than any of our lives, looking for the one groove it was built to fit, and it had found 3 generations of men who carried it home and kept it safe without ever knowing why, because something in them recognized it too, even if their hands never did. The shell didn't ask anything of me. It didn't unfold into some weapon or throw light across the shed or do any of the things I might have imagined, lying awake as a boy, if I'd ever let myself imagine what was really on that shelf. It just sat there in my palm, warm now, glowing soft and steady like a coal that stopped needing to be fed. Whatever it had been built to do, whatever the old wardens were, wherever they'd gone, whatever they'd left behind that this thing was a key to, none of that mattered yet. What mattered was that it had found the hand it was shaped for. And that hand turned out to be mine, the same way it would have turned out to be my father's, if he'd ever stopped being afraid long enough to hold it the way I just had. It down on the bench, careful, the light still moving slow along its seams, and I sat with it a while, in the quiet. Outside, the tide kept coming in, the way it always had, the way it would keep doing, whether or not anyone on this stretch of coast ever knew what had just woken up in a salvage shed built into the bones of an old wrecked ship. I don't know yet what it means, to be called that. I don't know what the old wardens were waiting for, or what they expect from a man who fixes drone engines for a living. But I know my grandfather kept this thing safe his whole life without understanding why. And so did his father before him, and that kind of keeping isn't nothing. That's its own kind of duty, carried blind, for 300 years, until the hand it was always meant for finally closed around it. I picked it back up before I turned off the lights. It fit the same as before. Better, maybe, now that it knew me. I set it on the shelf where it's always sat, but I left the light on a little longer than I needed to, just to watch that thin gold seam breathe, slow and patient, like something that had finally stopped waiting and started, after all this time, to rest.